American invasion of Mexico. Before the world ended and the vaults were sealed, America decided its southern neighbor was being a little too stingy with the crude oil. You see, Mexico had been the US's primary supplier of oil for years, but by the mid-21st century, Earth's resources were drying up fast, and Uncle Sam wasn't about to let a little thing like sovereignty get in the way of a full tank. So starting sometime before 2051, the US rolled out a long campaign of economic sanctions designed to financially gut Mexico from the inside, citing political instability and pollution as the excuse, which is pretty much like breaking into your neighbor's house and blaming their unmowed lawn. When Mexico had been sufficiently destabilized, the US military just walked across the border and took the oil refineries by force. And of course, Mexico wasn't compensated at all. But the real kick in the shins here was that by 2077, Poseidon Energy had swooped in through a subsidiary called PetroChico and just took over the refineries in Veracruz, Puebla, and Hidalgo. Nothing says freedom like a mega corporation inheriting the spoils of a military occupation. This invasion shook global relations so badly that Europe tried to copy the playbook. Euro-Middle Eastern War. In 2052, the European Commonwealth looked at what America had just pulled off in Mexico and collectively went, yeah, we'll have what he's having. That's because Europe was in a rough spot at the time. They were completely dependent on oil imports from the Middle East, and the Middle Eastern exporters had responded to dwindling global supplies the way any rational business would. They cranked the prices through the roof. Rather than pay up or negotiate, the European Commonwealth decided the cheaper option was to just kick through the door and start blasting. So in April of 2052, they rolled their tanks into the Middle East to seize the oil infrastructure directly, which historians now refer to as the official start of the resource wars. Obviously, the international response to that was not great at all. Oil prices immediately skyrocketed, smaller nations around the world went bankrupt overnight, and the United Nations, already barely functional, tried to intervene. But between May and July, so many countries stormed out of the UN in a huff that the organization formally dissolved in July 2052, 3 months into a war it was supposed to prevent. And boy, it escalated from there. In December 2053, an unknown group set off a nuclear device in Tel Aviv, which completely destroyed the place. Just a month later, in January 2054, the Middle East itself became the site of limited nuclear exchanges, the first time nukes had been used on the world stage since World War II, which sent every government on Earth into panic mode. The war dragged on for 8 brutal years with no winner, and by 2060, the Middle Eastern oil fields had completely dried up, which eliminated the entire reason for the war in the first place and left both sides in absolute ruin. 8 years of bloodshed, and the prize evaporated before anyone could claim it. That's humanity in a nutshell for you. European Civil War. With the Middle Eastern oil gone and the European Commonwealth bankrupt from 8 years of pointless warfare, the Union didn't so much dissolve as it disintegrated. Former member states turned on each other almost immediately, quarreling and bickering over whatever scraps of resources were left on the continent. There was no unifying enemy anymore, no shared goal, just a bunch of broke, tired, heavily armed countries fighting each other for leftovers. And none of it even matters, because while Europe was tearing itself apart, the two remaining superpowers, the United States and Communist China, were gearing up for a fight so much bigger that Europe's civil war became a footnote in the global collapse. The bickering continued all the way up to 2077, which we all know turned everything pointless. United States annexation of Canada. Americans don't really talk about this one much, because it's one of the darker chapters in US pre-war history. The whole thing started in winter 2066, when China invaded Alaska, and the US suddenly needed to move massive amounts of men and equipment through Canada to reinforce the Anchorage front. Canada initially told them no. By initially, I mean very briefly, because the US applied enough diplomatic pressure that Ottawa backed down almost immediately and let American troops march through their territory. From there, it just kept escalating. By 2069, the US military was stripping Canadian forests bare, Canadian protests were being completely ignored, and American citizens had started calling Canada Little America. A survey from the Fallout TV show even mentions that over 90% of Americans no longer considered Canada a sovereign country, which is an insane sentence to read out loud. Then in 2072, Canadian freedom fighters attempted to sabotage the Alaskan pipeline, which gave the US exactly the excuse they needed. And so the annexation was officially announced on June 3rd, 2072, though in the background it had been happening for years. By January 2076, it was complete. Canadian protesters and rioters were terminated on site, the Alaskan pipeline was swarming with American military units, and pictures of the atrocities started making their way back home, which sparked more protests on American soil, which got shut down by the same power armor units that had been occupying Canada in the first place. Even after all that, Canadian partisans kept fighting American occupiers well into October 2077, right up until the bombs made the whole argument moot. Chinese invasion of Alaska and the Anchorage front. If Mexico was the warm-up and the European War was the main event, Alaska was where everything went nuclear, both literally and figuratively. By the winter of 2066, China was on the brink of economic collapse. Their entire economy was built on fossil fuels, global oil had basically run out, and the US was refusing to share any of its own reserves. So China did what desperate superpowers do and launched a massive invasion of Alaska to seize the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline by force, and it was massive. Private First Class Henry Hodges, one of the American soldiers stationed there, later said in a holotape he'd never seen so many warships in his life, and that the Chinese invasion made Pearl Harbor look like an academy exercise. Under the command of General Jingwei, Chinese forces hit the ground in a two-pronged assault, one group pushing to take the city of Anchorage itself, the other tasked with securing the artillery overlook above it. Captain Zachary Lloyd said in a holotape that they held the overlook for hours, while Chinese warships bombarded the location, and he later claimed the Chinese killed more of their own troops through friendly fire than they killed Americans. But the highlight of the fight was the USS Eben Atoll, an American warship sunk during the battle, not by the Chinese, but by a nuclear torpedo fired from an American submarine called the USS Interference. They literally nuked their own ship. Anchorage eventually fell, and American defenders retreated south to Juneau, where they held the line for years while the Chinese dug into Alaska like they were planning to stay permanently. And thus began the Sino-American War, a conflict that would drag on for 11 years and end with the world on fire. Niagara sabotage and related Chinese espionage incidents. Long before the tanks rolled and the nukes flew, China was waging a quieter war inside America, and the Niagara sabotage was one of the rare times they got caught red-handed. In 2062, somewhere near Niagara Falls on the New York-Canada border, Chinese infiltrators carried out a sabotage operation against American infrastructure. The specifics are frustratingly vague. The Fallout canon never tells us exactly what was sabotaged, how many agents were involved, or what the damage actually was. What we do know is that a female Chinese operative named Wan Yang got scooped up by Canadian authorities during the investigation, and she did not stay scooped up for long. Wan Yang escaped custody during a prisoner transfer to Albany, New York, and then pulled off the espionage equivalent of a cross-country road trip, evading recapture for years until she was finally caught in Point Lookout, Maryland, and locked away in the Turtle Dove detention camp. But she was just one of many. Chinese sleeper agents and stealth armored soldiers had been quietly deployed all over the United States for years, with confirmed operations in DC, Point Lookout, and West Virginia. The US government's response was exactly as unhinged as you'd expect. They set up the Vigilant Citizens Hotline so ordinary Americans could call in their neighbors for suspicious communist-adjacent behavior. Chinese Americans were rounded up and forced into camps, and the entire country slipped into a second Red Scare that made the first one look polite, which tells you a lot about how the war actually started. It wasn't just about oil. Paranoia, espionage, and a decade of mutual hostility were quietly cooking in the background the whole time. US counter-invasion of mainland China. For years, the US government publicly insisted they were fighting a purely defensive war, just trying to kick the Chinese out of Alaska. Nothing more, pinky promise. That lasted until 2074, when American infantry, mechanized divisions, and power armor units suddenly showed up on the Chinese mainland, which is a pretty long way from Anchorage. The counter-invasion stretched the US military across 3 simultaneous fronts: Alaska, Canada, and mainland China, and the fighting was everywhere. There were major campaigns in the Gobi Desert, along the Yangtze River, and at the city of Nanjing, which ended up being a months-long meat grinder. US troops also pushed through Shantou and fought in Mambajiao, a Philippine island that one wartime newscaster cheerfully described as a perfect spot for American troops to drive screaming commie memes into the Bohol Sea, which is a sentence that would never fly on the 6 o'clock news today. In 2075, the DIA got spooked by reports of a Chinese ghost fleet, rumors that China had developed stealth submarines, which no one was particularly thrilled about. Then in June 2076, the US rolled out the T-51 power armor, and for a brief period the Chinese were so terrified of American miniguns in mechanized suits that entire units just surrendered on sight. But the advantage didn't last. The deeper American forces pushed into China, the harder the resistance got. Shanghai was still in Chinese hands well into 2077, and by October of that year, the rout had quietly transitioned into yet another stalemate. Billions of dollars and countless lives spent, with no victory in sight on either side, which is probably why both superpowers started looking real hard at their nuclear stockpiles. Anchorage Reclamation. Taking Anchorage back was supposed to be America's great triumph, and on paper it was. The reclamation officially began in 2067, just months after the Chinese invasion, and it dragged on for a full decade of brutal trench warfare in the Alaskan cold. The whole thing was commanded by General Constantine Chase, and it's where the US military first tested out power armor in combat, starting with the T-45, which got rushed into the field with known design flaws that got a lot of American soldiers killed. In the Fallout TV show, Cooper Howard flat out calls out a Vault Tech executive named Bud Askins for signing off on those flaws because the suits sure looked great. Truly the Ford Pinto of military equipment. The real game changer was the T-51 power armor rolled out in 2076, which finally tipped the balance hard enough for the US to start pushing the Chinese Chinese back. By January 11th, 2077, the winterized T-51 units under Chase had liberated Anchorage, General Jingwei was dead, and the Americans threw a celebration so enthusiastic that Nuka-Cola launched a whole new flavor called Nuka-Cola Victory to cash in on it. Peace talks between the US and China began in Anchorage shortly after, which was very bad news for Vault-Tec, because Vault-Tec's entire business model depended on selling vaults to a population terrified of nuclear war. In the show, Charles Whiteknife explicitly lays it out. Vault-Tec had a fiduciary responsibility to make sure those peace talks failed, and fail they did. As the negotiations dragged on without resolution, the US also started rolling T-60 power armor units out domestically for crowd control, turning soldiers fresh off the Chinese front against their own neighbors during the 2076 food riots. A lot of them deserted rather than fire on American citizens. The peace talks finally collapsed on the morning of October 23, 2077, in the very city that was supposed to be the symbol of hope. A few hours later, the bombs fell. And that's every war before the bombs fell in Fallout. Honestly, humanity was already speedrunning disaster before the nukes even dropped. Which war do you think changed the world the most? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more Fallout lore dives.